We have the man right here. Come on. Let's go, JD. We're putting you on stage.
Great. Yeah, look, I said what I said, which is that we do have, of course, a special relationship with our friends in the UK and also with some of our European allies. But we also know that there have been infringements on free speech that actually affect not just the British. Of course, what the British do in their own country is up to them, but also affect American technology companies and by extension American citizens. So that is something that we'll talk about today at lunch.
We've had free speech for a very, very long time in the United Kingdom, and it will last for a very, very long time. Well, no, I mean, certainly we wouldn't want to reach across US citizens, and we don't, and that's absolutely right. But in relation to free speech in the UK, I'm very proud of our history there.
Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer just got a rude awakening, and it came straight from across the Atlantic, with Donald Trump and JD Vance tearing into him on live TV. The result is that the UK Labour leader is scrambling to respond, but is this just the beginning of his troubles? Let's break it down. Starmer arrived in Washington to both Trump and JD Vance. He expected a cold shoulder, given his negative statements about Trump in the past, but he didn't expect to be mocked in the manner it was done. Frankly, both Trump and JD Vance piled on Starmer's humiliation, and reports emerged that Trump's team mocked his failed diplomatic move, while Vance bluntly stated Britain needed strong leadership, not someone clueless about global politics. The fallout, which snowballed each day, has brought fresh backlash. So desperate to regain control, Starmer planned a major speech hoping to reset the narrative. His team fine-tuned his messaging, but when the moment arrived, it was a disaster, and instead of strength, he delivered vague statements and empty promises.
Talking about. It is, for example, a prime minister of a country. Let's see now. Let's call it Great Britain. It has a prime minister who sees widespread unrest over his appalling migration policies, and in order to shut it down, starts arresting people left, right, and centre, and accusing those who worry about our escalating migrant crisis of being far-right thugs.
Absolutely.
That is an assault on freedom of speech, and that is exactly what JD Vance was talking about, and Keir Starmer is exactly who he was talking about. Let's remind ourselves, this is JD, we've got a couple of clips from him, but this is him talking about Europe and free speech.
I look to Brussels, where EU commissars warn citizens that they intend.
The aftermath was that the press dismissed it, the public wasn't convinced, and Labour MPs took notice. So, behind the scenes, senior party figures quietly discussed Labour's future without Starmer. So, Starmer's leadership is now hung by a thread. One more major failure, and his position could become untenable. The irony is, he had spent years branding himself as the competent alternative to Conservative chaos. Yet his own leadership is unravelling. Starmer saw himself as a diplomatic leader who could restore Britain's influence. His solution was a bold peace plan for Ukraine, but in reality, his plan collapsed instantly. His proposal wasn't just ignored, it was torn apart by global leaders, and his first miscalculation was assuming Washington and Moscow would take him seriously. The US was not preoccupied with internal battles over Ukraine funding, and Russia had no interest in Britain's involvement, so the idea of Starmer dictating peace terms was dismissed outright. Despite doubts from allies, he pushed forward, holding press conferences and framing his initiative as Britain's moment to reclaim global influence. Media allies praised him, but behind the scenes, scepticism grew. As European leaders were doubtful, even Ukrainian officials found his proposals vague, and Washington saw his plan as political posturing. Then came the final blow. Trump dismissed Starmer's efforts entirely, stating Britain had no real influence. Then Vice President JD Vance followed up, calling Starmer's plan a desperate attempt to stay relevant.
In his remarks at the Munich Security Conference, Vice President Vance condemned free speech violations in the UK, particularly. Could you respond? What is your
Well, I have an idea. We have the man right here. Come on. Let's go, JD. We're putting you on stage.
Great. Yeah, look, I said what I said, which is that we do have, of course, a special relationship with our friends in the UK and also with some of our European allies, but we also know that there have been infringements
The fallout was that within days, Starmer's foreign policy fell apart. His credibility was gone, and the world saw what had happened. He had bet big and lost even bigger. As backlash intensified, Starmer's floundered plan wasn't just ignored, it became a global embarrassment. But instead of reassessing, he lashed out, blaming critics, attacking the media and doubling down on his failed approach. His public response worsened things as he insisted his proposal was misunderstood, claiming world leaders needed time to see its value.
Cheers on the street outside. You have full backing across the United Kingdom, and we stand with you, with Ukraine, for as long as it may take. And I hope you heard some of that cheering in the street. That is the people of the United Kingdom coming out to demonstrate how much they support you, how much they support Ukraine, and our absolute determination to stand with you, unwavering determination, and to achieve what we both want to achieve, which is a lasting peace for Ukraine based on sovereignty.
However, no one bought it, and his credibility was in tatters. But it gets worse. Trump publicly mocked Starmer's plan. During a rally, he dismissed Britain's role in peace talks, calling Starmer a weak leader pretending to have influence. The crowd erupted in laughter.
And here's the thing, you know, when you would talk to the Biden administration officials in private, it's another example of a terrible situation the Biden admin left the Trump administration. When you ask them what's the plan, okay, we're going to spend tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars in Ukraine. What is your plan? And they would honestly tell you, well, we're just going to send them weapons for as long as we can and hope eventually they can turn the tide. Hope is not a strategy. Throwing money and ammunition at a terrible conflict, that is not a strategy. The only guy in town with a strategy is the President of the United States, and everybody needs to follow his lead.
What scares me is Zelensky, when he says it's going to go on for years, how many more lives are going to be lost? He's not going to have a country to save at the end of that. The minerals deal would have provided the monies to rebuild their country and a strong U.S. presence and maybe European troops as well.
And this is an important part of it. The president knows that, look, if you
Vice President J.D. Vance followed up by questioning why Starmer thought he had sway when even Washington was struggling to navigate the crisis. His blunt verdict, Starmer's plan was nothing more than empty words from a weak leader. Labour's response was disastrous. His team scrambled to spin the situation, accusing Trump and Vance of undermining diplomacy, but it was too late. The British public saw their Prime Minister humiliated on the world stage. Even pro-Labour media struggled to defend him.
Utterly disgraceful. That's the ultimate betrayal.
Well, what do you make of Keir Starmer as a man when you've interacted with him?
Well, look, frankly, I just think that he acts and thinks like an international human rights lawyer. He doesn't act and think like, how am I going to make people better off? How am I going to incentivize work? How am I going to incentivize risk-taking? And how am I going to make people more prosperous? He's got no idea at all. He's never run a business. No one in his team has ever run a business. They literally haven't got a clue. And all they seem to spend their time doing is betraying our country by giving our money away on overseas climate aid, on ridiculous carbon capture schemes, giving away tens of billions of pounds on giving away our own freehold called the Chagos Islands, strategically important defense asset. Utterly disgraceful. That's the ultimate betrayal, is giving our money away to other people when you're taking money away from our own pensioners. We've got 22,500.
Meanwhile, opposition leaders pounced. Conservatives accused him of weakening Britain's standing, and Nigel Farage called it proof Starmer was out of his depth. What should have been Starmer's moment to prove himself instead exposed his inability to navigate global politics. But rather than let the controversy fade, Starmer refused to back down. He insisted his approach was still the best, despite clear evidence it had collapsed. His advisers panicked. Diplomats admitted his credibility had been damaged, and European allies who initially supported him were now backing away. But the biggest blow didn't come from Washington, it came from Ukraine itself.
Thank you. It may be a great irony that a Remainer Prime Minister used Brexit freedoms as effectively as he did yesterday. Indeed, as Number 10 briefed, we are now in a unique position compared to the rest of Europe, and yesterday was a triumph. I also applaud him making such positive words about President Trump and our relationship with America, even if nobody behind him agrees. But here's the key. President Zelensky has now accepted that he's going to sign the minerals agreement with America. And America's going to put in $100 billion or whatever it is, and thousands of Americans will be in Ukraine. Is that of itself enough of a security guarantee? No. Or does it mean that we need to send British troops? And if we do, given the size of our army, how many?
The mineral deal is not enough on its own. But can I just remind him, Russia is the aggressor. Zelensky is a war leader whose country has been invaded. And we should all be supporting him.
The country Starmer claimed to be helping had no interest in his plan. Ukrainian officials dismissed it outright, seeing it as political posturing. Then came the most humiliating moment. When asked about Starmer's plan, Zelensky bluntly responded, "We have a strategy. We are working with our allies." He didn't even acknowledge Starmer's proposal. Back in Britain, the fallout was immediate. Even Labour-friendly commentators questioned how he miscalculated so badly in launching a peace plan without securing support from Ukraine or the US, raising serious doubts about his judgment.
President Zelensky arrives here tomorrow, and he's expressed concern, worry about what that end game looks like on the ground. Russia's top diplomat says any peacekeepers in Ukraine are a non-starter. So how do you work around all of that? I know you said the deal needs to be settled, but it seems like that's a big part of the deal.
Well, the talks have only just begun. President Zelensky's here tomorrow, so we need to get to that deal. But I think there's a shared understanding, an agreement with President Trump, of course, President Zelensky, and ourselves and others, that that deal needs to last. It's a historic deal. It'll be an incredible achievement by President Trump, but we need to defend it. We need to defend the line, protect the deal, and therefore we've got to have a discussion about what that looks like. And I think the discussion tomorrow is predominantly going to be about minerals, but as the President has said on a number of occasions, including today, that in itself is an element of a security guarantee, because if there is an agreement on minerals, that means there'll be US economic interests at stake in Ukraine.
Starmer had positioned himself as the leader who could restore Britain's influence. Instead, he had exposed Britain's irrelevance in global diplomacy and shattered his own credibility, as Starmer's failure deepened, and Labour MPs now see an opening. For months, quiet doubts about his leadership had lingered. Now those doubts turned into outright rebellion. Senior figures who had once stood by him have started distancing themselves. Some cautiously suggested Labour needed to rethink its foreign policy approach, while others were more directly questioning Starmer's competence. One anonymous MP told reporters, "This isn't just embarrassing, it's damaging. He's made Britain look weak." Another former ally admitted that if he can't handle foreign policy, how can he lead us into an election? But the real problem wasn't just internal dissent, it was shifting public perception. Starmer had built his image as a steady alternative to Conservative chaos. Now that image was crumbling. So Labour's internal divisions became impossible to ignore. Behind closed doors, discussions about a leadership challenge are heating up as names like Lisa Mandy and Yvette Cooper began circulating. Even Angela Rayner, known for her strong leadership presence, reportedly started preparing for the possibility of change. Then you have to consider the polls. Labour's lead over the Conservatives has been shrinking as voters once open to Starmer are rethinking their support.
I mean, we've done a lot of history on this show already, but the Labour Party was founded in part by the Labour movement, and it is striking that we're not seeing support for strikers, if you excuse the pun. I mean, I think the problem, and I've said this on the show before, that Keir Starmer has, is that he's basically ruled out adopting any policy that Jeremy Corbyn even touched or, even mooted at any point. So anything in the 2017 and 2019 manifestos is just completely off the table, which is really ironic because we've seen now a lot of actually journalists on the right even saying we're probably going to end up with something like Corbyn's economic policies to deal with this crisis.
The word weak was now synonymous with his leadership. The leadership crisis is no longer a question of if, it was a matter of when, as Labour's poll numbers keep slipping, Starmer's approval ratings falling further in key battleground areas. Even former Labour supporters are reconsidering their votes. As expected, the media has been relentless, and Labour MPs, sensing blood, are preparing to strike. Ultimately, the cracks in his leadership had grown too wide to ignore, and the forces that would decide Starmer's fate weren't in Washington or Kiev, they were in Westminster, where ambitious Labour politicians were watching, waiting and preparing to move. Overall, his leadership had reached the breaking point. The only question now is how much longer would he hold on to power? If you enjoyed this political content, like the video and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating political discussions.